As I rise to make my contribution, Mr. President, to this, my first policy debate, I want to take this opportunity to congratulate the Honorable Prime Minister, Honorable Philip J. Pierre, Mr. President, on the presentation of his maiden budget. And I thank you, Mr. President, and the Senate for the opportunity to allow me to address a few substantive issues, a few substantive pronouncements as it relates to the budget. Allow me, Mr. President, to also thank those who continue to support and encourage me as I endeavor to assist in the formulation of policy for our country, St. Lucia, those who continue to constructively criticize, and those who lend support and assistance as I chart this path, Mr. President. Mr. President, in my analysis of the budget presented by the Prime Minister, we've heard the pronouncement that it is in fact the largest budget in the history of St. Lucia. And for me, Mr. President, on reviewing, on contemplating on the content of the budget, the most significant aspect of it for me was not with regards to its size, but with regards, Mr. President, to a few pertinent questions that I think really is what determines how good of a budget it is, Mr. President. And when I looked over and when I listened, when I read through the budget, Mr. President, some of the obvious questions and some of the obvious items that I used to determine how efficient or how good this budget would be for our people, does it meet the current needs of our people? What is in it for the poor and the underprivileged of our country? And how will it bring relief to the many who have been affected as a result of COVID-19, as a result of the ongoing war in Ukraine, and as a result of what I deem to be 5 years of neglect, victimization, and misplaced priorities by the previous government? Monsieur le Président, ça m'a dit, c'est là moi garder budget. C'est question moi demander comment pour prendre détermination as est budget ça là, c'est un budget qui bon pour Jean pays Saint-Lucie. C'est ainsi budget a joindre situation nous joindre qu'on nous dans. Est-ce qu'il y a droit ces situation, Monsieur le Président? Ainsi budget ça là ni bagaille dans pour adresser situation gens qui pauvres et gens qui pas privilège jeune koyo dedans. Et Monsieur le Président, ainsi il a mené titak space by gens qui a affecté because of COVID-19, la ni war ka aller en Ukraine, et c'est moun qui joine plus affecté 5 l'année parce yote la teni neglect, yote Newton manière previous administration a parlé about certain constituency côté yo décidé yo just pas kay faire rien ces constituency ça là yo pas kay mettre resources of the constituency ça là because yo pas supporter direction gouvernement previous gouvernement Mr. Speaker, Mr. President. So un budget qui présenté par premier ministre là supposé en opinion moi adresser ces bagaille ça là. And so, Mr. President, I want to focus on a few areas. I know my colleagues are adequately versed to deal with a lot of the areas, and so I will not deal with all of them, but those I feel that have stood out to me. And of course, as it may be obvious, Mr. President, I will begin by looking at what was placed in the budget for the agricultural and fisheries sector, Mr. President. Of course, we've heard it. We've heard the pronouncements. We've continued to speak about food security. And of course, we have been placed in a situation, and I keep saying that as much as COVID-19 has affected a lot of things in our country, a lot of things in the world, Mr. President, we really need to look at the situation of COVID-19 and pull out what are the lessons we can learn from that situation. And at the end of it, Mr. President, are we coming out of it the better prepared to ensure that our country is more secure when it comes to food for the citizens of our country. And so, of course, I would have looked at this budget and asked myself, in the allocations for the agriculture, fisheries, food production, and rural development sector, what is in there for the people of St. Lucia? I have looked at the budget, Mr. President, and I must say that I am pleased to report that I am happy about the plans presented by the Honorable Prime Minister and supported by the Minister of Agriculture in terms of the trajectory that we are looking to take our country to when it comes to food production and when it comes to the plans for the agriculture and fisheries sector. Mr. President, if we look at the Economic and Social Review of 2021, page 31, for those of us who may want to follow, it notes that there were financing difficulties and there were high input costs brought about by COVID-19 that further impeded the sector's performance. And to me, what that says, Mr. President, is that we already have a platform and a basis by which we can build on in order to ensure that we are sustainable when it comes to the production of our food and feeding our people. Because even in a period where we were experiencing hardships, as noted in the Economic and Social Review, there was some level of expansion, and notably in the areas of livestock and fish. So there is hope for us. And so it's really up to a government of this day, Mr. President, to expand, to grow, to place the resources, the scarce resources of this country in a manner in that sector that will really help to build on where we are, Mr. President, to ensure that it achieves its goal. Mr. President, it's no secret to all of us that agriculture has been one of the sectors of our economy that has really kept us going. It's one of the biggest contributors, perhaps, maybe only behind tourism. But it has contributed significantly to the development of our country and to our economy. Mr. President, I was very excited and I listened very, very closely, especially to the Minister of Agriculture as he laid out the plans of his ministry where agriculture and fisheries is concerned. And I must say that I was very happy to hear some of the plans. And it's, of course, things that we've heard spoken about many times. But, Mr. President, it is important to understand that we need to put our shoulders to the wheel if we are to achieve our end goal of ensuring that there is food security for our country, St. Lucia. So, Mr. President, I will take a little time to delve into some of what I consider the most substantive issues that were raised. And I begin with the move to decrease the level of labor intensity and increase the level of mechanization and modernization in the agricultural sector, Mr. President. We may consider agriculture and the production of food as archaic because our people have done it forever, Mr. President. They've had to feed themselves forever. There have been some level of growth and some level of development in the agricultural sector, but I think that we are so far behind when it comes to improving and increasing the level of modernization and mechanization in that sector, Mr. President. And so I am very elated, but I heard the minister pronounce that there will be a move to greater mechanization and greater modernization in that sector. Mr. President, we have to be strategic. We have to be strategic about how we move to modernize and mechanize that sector. Mr. President, too often we see governments spend monies on purchasing heavy equipment with a view to doing just that in the agricultural sector. But it is not supported by the necessary processes and procedures to ensure that there is a level of fairness and equity in the use and access to these equipment, Mr. President, so that every St. Lucian, despite where you are, if you are part of the agricultural sector, that you can benefit from it without prejudice, Mr. President. And so I look forward to the added procedures, like I said, the added processes in scheduling, for example, of a system. The government will spend monies, for example, to purchase a tiller, to purchase a machine to plow, Mr. President. But unless it is supported by a system whereby every farmer who requires use of it can be placed on a proper scheduling system, instead of having to wait sometimes for months upon end, and instead, Mr. President, of some of them being privileged by virtue of certain constituencies that they're placed in, because perhaps they have greater access to the Minister of Agriculture, and we know these things have happened in the past, that there is a level of equity and a level of fairness in the way in which they go about accessing these equipment, Mr. President. We heard of the pronouncement of the land rationalization, and as an effort to increase access to farmers, both those who are existing and those who want to come into the sector, Mr. President. There is a heavy thrust on ensuring that our youth can get access to agricultural lands, Mr. President, both to help in food security, but also for them to be able to create an economic avenue for themselves, Mr. President, to be able to create their own space, to be able to create their own way of gaining income, Mr. President. And so that for me is very important. The access to land, understanding what exists in terms of land, the different topographies, and making a wise decision in terms of what level of equipment and what type of equipment and mechanization we go into. Mr. President, in the agricultural sector, we have to be very serious about the increase of output. But to go hand in hand with an increase of output, Mr. President, we have to be serious about storage and preservation, Mr. President, to ensure that when we find ourselves in a situation where mobility is restricted, where importing is restricted, Mr. President, of whether it's raw materials or packaged foods or whatever the case may be, that we can sustain ourselves in St. Lucia, whilst we perhaps wait for the additional things that we need to be able to sustain ourselves. And so there must be a serious look and a serious move towards ensuring that we increase output. And one of the ways I think that we can do that, and you know, I heard the Minister of Agriculture allude to it, Mr. President, is one of the things that is very prohibitive to our farmers is the cost of the input required to ensure that they thrive, and to ensure that the bottom line is a bottom line that can actually sustain their families and lend itself to the GDP of our country. One of the areas that I know the land farmers cry a lot about, because it is a troubling aspect of it, Mr. President, is a prohibitive cost of fertilizers. And so I think it is the time, Mr. President, where we look at what exists, Mr. President, and ask ourselves, how could we actually lend support to ensuring that our farmers can reduce the cost of their fertilizers? Are we ready to go? Are we ready to go into a rigorous program of being able to now produce more fertilizers in-house, more fertilizers on island, rather than depending on imports, Mr. President? And the minister alluded to organic fertilizers, to mulching, to composting. And we cannot continue to stay in our little area and speak of these things, Mr. President. I think the time is now that we start on an island-wide program of educating our farmers, educating our households on how they can utilize the things that are right within our households, right outside of our houses, Mr. President, to look at composting, to look at mulching, to look at organic fertilizers, Mr. President. Mr. President, of course, one of the things that made me very happy is a pronouncement by the minister that at least 3 fish aggregating devices, FADs, will be deployed within this financial year. I find myself, Mr. President, in a situation where not to be biased, but of course, sea farming is more perhaps the area that brings greater interest, obviously, because of my background, Mr. President. And so it brought me great pleasure to hear that pronouncement. The fishers have been clamoring, Mr. President, for some sort of relief. And we also heard the hand-in-hand pronouncement to look at the campaign promise of reducing the tax that was placed on the fuel, Mr. President. Fuel happens to be one of the biggest costs to a fisher. To have to fill at least 3 or 4 tanks of gas totaling at least $500 to $700 on a daily basis, to go out there on the open seas, not knowing what is out there for them, Mr. President, and being able now to be at a position where additional funds will be deployed, giving them the opportunity to reduce on the cost of fuel consumption and fuel usage, being a little more sure that when they venture out, they will be able to come back in with at least the minimum amount required to purchase fuel to go back on another adventure, Mr. President. I think the fishers will find that quite well and quite suiting to help that situation, Mr. President. Of course, we are also looking forward to the presentation by the announcement by the Prime Minister in terms of how he's going to deal with the $1.50 that was imposed on the fishers, Mr. President, by virtue of that tax being added to the fuel. But I think in the interim, and Mr. President, this is a marked progress mark of a government who cares for people. That as much as we cannot deal with all of the issues presented immediately, and we've seen and we've heard, Mr. President, that it seems sometimes I ask myself, have we forgotten how to count, or have we forgotten how to say the months of the year? Because when you hear sometimes persons who are associated with the opposition speak of the things that they've expected this government to achieve in a little over 9 months, Mr. President, that they had gone more than 5 years and they were not able to achieve, you wonder sometimes if you have to go back to the classroom and learn how to count. But a government who cares for the people, Mr. President, understanding that they campaigned on certain aspects, and the $150 tax on the fuel is one of the things, understanding that they cannot snap their fingers and make it disappear, whilst the consultation is going on, Mr. President, to determine the best way to do it, there are interim measures that this government is putting in to ensure that they ease the squeeze, Mr. President. So as of last week, Mr. President, I could have walked to work, and I could have sat with the fishers, Mr. President, and I could have sat with the other members of the fishers cooperatives in St. Lucia, and we could have blown the trumpet of the additional funds that this government is providing for the fishers in order to cushion the blow whilst we wait for the greater relief, Mr. President. Mr. President, of great concern to me as well in the fishing sector is the issue of marketing of the commodity. The reality is one thing to reduce the cost for the fishers. It is one thing that the fishers can now go out there and extract more fish from the ocean. But the question of where do they sell it, Mr. President, I do not think that it should be the responsibility of the extractor of the resource to also concern themselves with the marketing of the commodity, Mr. President. And what we saw over 5 years, and I will be first to admit that the arrangement with St. Lucia Fish Marketing, it was not working. There was need to look at this entity, Mr. President, and to determine what was the best way forward for this organization, Mr. President. And of course, the previous administration embarked on what we assumed was sustainable discourse to determine where next to take the St. Lucia Fish Marketing Corporation, Mr. President. But the fishers of this country were left with a slap in their face when we woke up one morning and all of a sudden we became aware, very, very loosely, that this entity had been gifted or given away to a private entity with absolutely no consultation with the fishers as to how that entity was supposed to work and benefit them, Mr. President. And 5 years into the business of the previous administration, the fishers of this country, even when they were hit by the issues of COVID and restrictions to movement, Mr. President, and closures which were necessary to deal with COVID-19, they were left struggling to determine what to do with their fish. And so this new administration, Mr. President, has been now left with this issue, this bobo, this maleng, Mr. President, of what to do with the fish marketing entity. We really do not know where it's at this point, and the fishers are clamoring for answers, Mr. President. And so I'm hoping that this government, Mr. President, with the thrust to put people first, in 9 months, yes, 9 months, we're hoping that by the time we are able to adequately settle down and look at all of these issues, that the St. Lucia fish marketing issue will be an issue no more, Mr. President, an issue no more. An issue no more. because it is important for them to do that, Mr. President. It is important that the fishers have a place. And if we go back in history, Mr. President, and we look at the reason that this entity was established, it was established for a simple reason: to be able to purchase the fish that the fishers land, Mr. President. That was its simple mandate. And like I indicated, it was given away, it was gifted. I'm not sure whether the previous administration was Santa Claus when it came to a particular thing, but they gave it away, Mr. President. They gave it away. And so, Mr. President, I applaud this government with the actions that they've already taken with regards to the sector. A few weeks ago, we sat here and we looked at the amendment to the Agricultural and Fisheries Incentive Act, Mr. President, and I am happy to report that I attended a meeting not too long ago with the Minister of Commerce and the Minister of Agriculture, and that was one of the heated discussions that came up in that consultation, Mr. President. The issue of the Incentives Act, and especially when we zoom in terms of the fishers, the issue of the FAR vehicles for fishers, Mr. President. And I'm happy to report that this government, a government who believes in the cause of the people and championing the cause of the people, saw it fit that as the fishing sector is evolving, that was a necessary move for the fishers of this country, Mr. President. Mr. President, I now turn my attention to the facilities at Savans Bay and Poale, Mr. President. This administration, Mr. President, embarked on a venture to create a more sophisticated and a more advanced, an easier way, a more modernized way for the fishers of the East Coast to do their fishing, Mr. President. And so a jetty was erected at Poale and a jetty at Savans Bay. Accompanying these jetties, Mr. President, was facilities for locker rooms, as we call it, as we refer to it in the sector, Mr. President. And so long after, Mr. President, that the previous administration inherited these facilities are yet to be handed over to the fishers of these communities that they were intended for, Mr. President. And again, I found myself in a very peculiar situation leading up to the elections of 2021, Mr. President, where a certain individual in the constituency of Beaufort North attempted, by association of course, to brainwash the fishers of that community into believing that it was a deliberate move by certain people associated with the then opposition to not open the facility, Mr. President. Easily debunked, Mr. President. The minister responsible for the facilities was a minister of the UWP administration, Mr. President. So how could it have been possible that a single individual within the constituency could have derailed the progress and the process of the project, not an individual in any means within the Ministry of Agriculture? So they went about in an attempt to sully the opposition, the then opposition, and they tooted all sorts of noise and blew all sorts of trumpets, Mr. President. Whilst that administration was in power, whilst that administration formed the government, what is it that prevented them from opening the facility for the fishers, Mr. President? But I am happy to announce, Mr. President, that as of last month, a greater move has been made towards the opening and the handing over of that ceremony. And so finally, one of the things that was keeping, and simple things, Mr. President, very simple things, a Lucilec connection, Mr. President. A Lucilec connection, Mr. President. And I'm happy to announce to this honorable house and to announce to the populace of St. Lucia, Mr. President, that as of last month, Lucilec has been open to be able to go in there. The account has been created, Mr. President, and Lucilec is now looking at the infrastructural activities that is required to be done in order to connect the electricity for the fishers at Savans Bay, Mr. President. Electricity, yes, electricity. That really is all that the previous government needed to do in order to ensure that the facility was open. A government putting people first, Mr. President. Mr. President, again, as I close this area in terms of agriculture and food production, I want to reiterate that I support the ventures of this government in terms of agriculture and food production. I think, of course, there is always more to do. There is always more to do, Mr. President. There is always new ways. There is always a new way to do things. There is always new thinking. And there is always more that needs to be done. And there is always a greater expectation from the people whom we serve. But given our fiscal position, given the external pressures on our finances, Mr. President, I think that our government is well on the way to ensuring that we again set that path, because you have to set a foundation, Mr. President, especially when you did not find one coming in, that our government is set on a path to ensure that we are able to sustain our economy and provide wholesome food to the people of our country, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to speak briefly on the issue of national security, the issue of crime, Mr. President. As the leader of government business alluded in his presentation, it is no secret. It is no secret to any of us that criminal activity has been on the rise, Mr. President. And we have to stop the business of making this issue become a political brawl, Mr. President. I think we as leaders, we owe it to our citizens, we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to our people, Mr. President, to ensure that there is a collective front when it comes to dealing with the issues of crime and national security, Mr. President. But it is also the responsibility of the government, Mr. President, to ensure that they create the platforms, that they provide the resources and the tools required by our law enforcement personnel to be able to carry out their responsibility, Mr. President. And so, over the last few months, and yes, over the last 9 months, within the last 9 months, Mr. President, we've seen one area that has been beefed up, Mr. President, is a provision of increased transportation to our police, Mr. President, in order to help them to carry out their duties, Mr. President. And that is just the beginning of things to come for the police, Mr. President. I was very happy, being a Southerner, Mr. President, to hear that finally, after so long, that there will be some much needed and long overdue attention to the Vieux-Fort police station. Mr. President, I am yet to understand why, at a time when we all admitted that crime was on the rise, that the police officers of Vieux-Fort had been treated like nomads by the previous administration, Mr. President. Coming from the original home at Binfield, they were moved to Clark Street first, and then back to Binfield in another building, Mr. President, a building that you can stand at and look through the library, Mr. President, and see the police station, Mr. President. The question is, why is it? What is it that has been so complicated and so intricate? And perhaps it's intricate. Perhaps it's a difficult situation to deal with. I don't know. But if that were the case, Mr. President, I would have loved the previous administration and the minister who was then responsible for the police to come out and tell the St. Lucian populace, well, this is the situation at the Vieux-Fort police station. It's insurmountable. We cannot deal with it. And this is the reasons why we are taking these decisions. But we never got any of that. What we saw, what was very visible to us, is that the police had been made to move from place to place to place. By the time they had settled on that previous Library Credit Union building on Clark Street, they were moved again, Mr. President. And so how do you expect the police to adequately carry out their responsibilities, Mr. President, if we cannot provide them with the basic things that they need to function? A home, a place where they can go to, where the documents, where the resources are available under a single roof so that they can carry out their responsibility. And so again, I accentuate that as a Southerner, Mr. President, I am very happy that I heard that pronouncement being made by the responsible minister that this long overdue malaise in Vieux-Fort will be dealt with once and for all. Mr. President, there must be a strategic thrust to ensure that we restore confidence of our people in the department charged with the responsibility to protect us. And so, like I indicated, as a government, you must be able to provide the necessary resources for them to carry out their task, Mr. President. There must be a great level of stoic, untainted leadership when it comes to our police force, Mr. President. The adages and the fear that had been created by I have to say the perceived, it is perceived, the perceived relationship between partisan and leadership of such an important area in our country, Mr. President. And no government, not the one currently leading this country, not any other, Mr. President, should ever create a situation where the citizens of this country are not sure whether they are coming or whether they are going because the leadership of the police force is tainted or is assumed to be associated openly with any political party. As leaders of this country, we have to ensure that we never put such leaders in these positions, Mr. President, because we need to be able to create a situation where our citizens can trust the police, Mr. President. Mr. President, coupled with the inability to, in terms of this same ministry, Mr. President, one of the things that was of great concern to persons like me who understand the plight of the average citizen, the underprivileged citizen, Mr. President, is the issue of the distress fund. Mr. President, for 5 years, maybe it's just me, but I could not tell where we were with the distress fund. At one time, it was accessible through the Prime Minister's office. At one time, there were particular parliamentary representatives who would write but not receive responses. Mr. President, it was overwhelming, the stories and the analogies that were drawn.
Senator, you have 15 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. President.
To conclude your presentation.
In terms of that area, Mr. President, and so as an individual coming from a community and a constituency, a country where I know, Mr. President, that there are a lot of people who have in the past benefited from such a government program, not because they put themselves in a situation, but really a lot of the times they really can't help themselves in terms of the insurance aspect of the plywood houses and so on, Mr. President, knowing that there is a greater level of assurance and a greater level of clarity in terms of how you access these funds, Mr. President. I am very happy that this government saw it fitting to place this fund back and again, it's about how we access it, Mr. President, and it's about the clarity of how you access it and where you go and what you do if you in fact find yourself in a situation knowing that your partisan or your political affiliation will not affect whether you can access this fund, Mr. President. And so I'm very glad to have heard that pronouncement, Mr. President. And the very firefighters, and whilst I'm on that, Mr. President, allow me to extend International Firefighters Day. Yesterday, the firefighters, they celebrated International Firefighters Day, Mr. President. And so I take this opportunity, Mr. President, to thank them for their stellar service to this country. I know as frontline workers, they were under a lot of pressure during COVID-19, coupled with the other routine things that the fire service has to deal with, Mr. President. And the reality is that they did it under very, very trying circumstances. And I do not speak of the COVID-19 circumstances, Mr. President. I speak of the fact that the fire service has been inadequately resourced, Mr. President, inadequately resourced. If you ever look closely at any clip where the fire personnel is to go on out of fire, Mr. President, you see the safety equipment that they're wearing, Mr. President. It is not up to standard in terms of what they should be wearing, Mr. President. And it is a direct result of the fact that they have been neglected over the last 5 years, Mr. President. We saw the fire service embarking on capital projects, on all sorts of things, Mr. President, which perhaps are necessary to a particular degree. But the most fundamental things is the security and the safety of the fire personnel who walk into burning buildings, Mr. President, who go out there to save our people, to save lives and to save property, and they were not given the respect that were due to them by ensuring that they had proper safety equipment, Mr. President. This is absurd, Mr. President. And so I'm happy that there has been a pronouncement by this government to ensure, Mr. President, that these things are looked into and the necessary resources will be provided to the fire service, similarly to the police force, Mr. President. Again, a government who puts the people first. Our frontline workers, Mr. President, our emergency personnel, Mr. President, and the persons whom they are intended to serve, Mr. President, because they will surely benefit from the fire service having the necessary equipment to be able to take care of the needs as they arise, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I close, and of course there are a lot of other things that I could speak of, if in fact I had more time to speak about it, Mr. President, because The pronouncement in this budget warrants, if we are to speak of it, and speak of all of the measures, Mr. President, was pronounced by the Prime Minister to bring relief to our people, Mr. President, I will require so much more time, Mr. President. And so I have decided simply to focus on these, and I know my learned colleagues around the table will give due justice to other aspects of the budget, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, as I close now, I want to implore our St. Lucian people that at this juncture where we find ourselves economically, socially, and the other things that plague us, Mr. President, that it is a juncture where tough but sensitive decisions have to be made, Mr. President. And this is the reason why I lend my full support to the Prime Minister of this country, Mr. President, because as much as the tough decisions have to be made to take us back on a path of good footing, Mr. President, this Prime Minister always shows a level of empathy and a level of sensitivity, Mr. President, for the people in our country who need it most, Mr. President. It is a Prime Minister who always asks when decisions have to be made, how will it affect the most vulnerable within our country, Mr. President? That question is always asked. And it is obvious, Mr. President, that the opposition does not understand that phenomenon, Mr. President, because not too long ago, I found myself in a situation where apparently my freedom of speech seemed to have been almost swept beneath my feet, simply because I spoke up about the housing program that this government has initiated, Mr. President. And I indicated that an individual associated with the opposition, Mr. President, had made a pronouncement that the condition in which a gentleman had been removed and placed in a better condition, Mr. President, was not even fitting for her dog, Mr. President. And this touched me to my very core, Mr. President, because the reality is there are too many people in our country who unfortunately find themselves in situations that are less than lovely, that are less than roses and wine, Mr. President. But the reality is that the opposition cannot relate to situations like that. It's all about fluff and grandeur for them, Mr. President. And so they do not come down to the level of the persons who are most vulnerable in our country and ask the question, how can we remove them from these situations? How can we ensure that the most vulnerable among us is educated? They have access to education. They have devices, Mr. President, to ensure that they can access their schoolwork and so on, Mr. President, to give them an opportunity to move up within the stratas of society. And this is what this government is doing, Mr. President, in terms of their policy direction, Mr. President, ensuring that they look out for the most vulnerable amongst us so that they can feel part and parcel of this society, because they are equally St. Lucians, Mr. President. They are equally St. Lucians. And a government who cares for its people ensure that policies, programs, and procedures are put in place not to keep them in poverty, not to keep them in the conditions where they are at, but to give them an opportunity, Mr. President, a shoulder to lean on so that they can move up the strata, so that they can start to contribute even more meaningfully to our country, Mr. President. And so, Mr. President, by saying all of this, I say, Mr. President, that I am in full support and I support the motion that has been tabled before us in terms of the budget presented by our Honorable Prime Minister. Mr. President, I thank you, and again I implore St. Lucians to do what they must, Mr. President, to ensure that the implementation aspects of this budget takes flight, Mr. President, because it is one thing for the Prime Minister to make the pronouncement, but it's another thing to ensure that our technocrats who are responsible for the ministries, the permanent secretaries, the accounts departments, and all other personnel within the respective ministries bring these policies to fruition for the betterment of our country and for the betterment of the people of St. Lucia. I thank you, Mr. President.